The man stepped quietly into the room, carrying nothing but the soft weight of himself. The air was already full of voices, soft, hurried, and familiar to those who spoke them. Laughter drifted lightly across the walls. Small gestures moved from hand to hand, and everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged. And yet, he did not belong. At least, not yet. He did not demand attention. He did not speak loudly to claim space. He simply moved to the edge of the gathering and let himself settle there, as if he had always known this would be the way to enter a room that did not notice him. His hands rested lightly on his knees, his posture calm, unassuming, and patient. It was a posture that seemed to say, "I am here, and yet I do not need to prove it." Have you ever noticed how people can be present in a space and still unseen? How they can sit quietly, and the room rushes past them without ever truly seeing. Perhaps it is because their value is not measured in noise, in laughter, in the exchange of clever words. Perhaps it is because those who watch too closely rarely notice the calm that does not beg for attention. The man's eyes swept slowly across the faces around him. He did not stare. He did not search for approval. He simply observed. There was a gentle curiosity in the way he watched, not one of judgment, but of quiet awareness. He noticed the small movements, the way someone's hand twitched when a thought came to mind, the way a smile lingered a little too long, the way voices rose and fell, as if in a secret rhythm only they could hear, and yet no one noticed him. Not at first. The room continued in its familiar dance of conversation and amusement, filled with the kind of small gestures that fill spaces without ever changing them. He sat at the edge, a still presence, as if he were a shadow, quietly observing the light. It is strange, he thought, how easy it is to be overlooked when you do not announce yourself. But there is a freedom in being unseen, a quiet freedom to watch, to feel, to understand, without being caught in the expectations of others. The whispers and laughter drifted around him. Some of them were gentle, harmless. Some carried a faint sharpness, the subtle edge of judgment that people do not often recognize in themselves. The man did not flinch. He did not turn away. He did not shift to claim their attention. He simply remained calm and steady, letting the room exist exactly as it had chosen to exist. After a while, a voice turned toward him, half curious, half amused. "Why do you sit there in silence?" The question floated softly, not meant to wound, but to draw him out, to see if he would step into the rhythm of the room. He lifted his eyes slowly, meeting theirs without haste, without urgency. "I am only watching," he said quietly, his voice calm, deliberate, like a soft breeze moving through still water. It was not loud. It was not demanding. It simply existed. A small smile passed across some faces. A few people chuckled quietly as if to test whether his calm could be broken. But the man did not react. He allowed the laughter and the curiosity to pass over him, like stones skipping across a pond's surface. Each one left a tiny ripple, but none disturbed the depth beneath. And in that stillness, something subtle began to happen. The room, once filled with its own restless energy, began to feel slightly different. The laughter seemed smaller. The voices softened, not because anyone forced it, but because the presence of someone who did not need to be seen or heard made the room notice its own noise. He did not seek their attention, and yet by not seeking it, he had already begun to hold it. The room was learning something it did not yet understand, that a quiet presence can be heavier than any argument, that a calm heart can outlast 1,000 restless ones, that the simple act of sitting still can carry more weight than any spoken word. And so he remained at the edge of the gathering, a silent observer, a quiet stranger in a room that had overlooked him. He was unnoticed, and in that unnoticed state, he was free. Free to feel, free to watch, free to be exactly what he was without bending to the expectations of others. Have you ever felt that freedom? The freedom of being unseen, of not needing to prove your value to those who cannot yet recognize it? It is a freedom that carries a strange kind of power, a quiet kind of strength. And in that strength, there is the beginning of something larger than any noise the world could make. He sat there, watching, listening, letting the room exist in its own way, while inside himself he carried a calm that no laughter could shake, no whisper could unsettle, no glance could diminish. And in that calm, he was already beyond the reach of their judgment. The room continued. The voices rose and fell. The small movements and whispers persisted. And yet the man remained quietly at the edge, untouched, unwavering, carrying within him a stillness that would not be broken. It was a stillness that spoke without words, a quiet dignity that no one had yet learned to hear. The room continued in its gentle, restless rhythm. Words rose and fell like the quiet waves of a slow river. Some voices carried amusement. Others carried small judgments hidden beneath polite tones. And still, the man at the edge remained silent. His presence had not changed. He did not lean forward or withdraw. He simply existed in the space, letting the energy of the room pass through him without disturbance. Have you ever noticed how people grow? Uneasy when someone refuses to follow the current they have set. When they throw a question, a jest, a challenge, and the expected ripple does not come back. It is a subtle discomfort, almost invisible, but powerful in its own way. That is what the man allowed to happen, not intentionally, not forcefully, but by simply being still. They spoke around him, sometimes softly, sometimes with small bursts of laughter, as if testing the quiet that seemed to surround him. A few glances were cast his way, curious, almost impatient, but he did not meet them with anger nor with explanation. He did not try to defend his silence, because his silence was not empty. It was full of something that could not be measured by words or opinions. It is a strange thing how often the world expects reactions. When someone remains calm, when someone refuses to argue, when someone does not seek approval, the people around them grow uncertain. They look for flaws. They search for weaknesses. They wait for a crack in the calm, a moment of doubt, a flicker of irritation. And when it does not come, they begin to feel the subtle power, quiet strength. The man's eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in the small gestures of others. The way one person's hand trembled slightly as they smiled. The way another's eyes shifted away, almost unwilling to meet his gaze. He noticed, yes, but there was no judgment in his observation. He only understood. He understood that their reactions, or lack of understanding, were a reflection of their own expectations, not a measure of his worth. A voice rose gently, almost teasing. "Why do you sit there without speaking? Surely you have something to say." It was not cruel, nor mocking, but it carried the weight of their anticipation. They wanted a response. They expected it. And yet, the man remained calm. His lips did not move. His posture did not change. And in that stillness, he offered a lesson they had not asked for and were not yet ready to hear. Have you ever felt the quiet power of not reacting? The strength that grows when you let the noise of the world pass through without taking it inside. That is what the man carried. Not arrogance, not pride, not a desire to teach. Only the steady presence of someone who understood that silence is often stronger than any spoken word. Time stretched slowly in the room. The laughter softened, the whispers diminished, and the small gestures became still. The space seemed to breathe differently, almost as if it recognized the calm that did not seek recognition. The man's quietness had begun to ripple outward, not in sound, but in awareness. The room itself began to feel the weight of what had been unspoken. He did not move to fill the silence with explanation or reason. He did not argue to show his value. He simply allowed the space to exist as it was, letting others sit with their own thoughts, letting them confront the small disquiet that his calm presence had stirred. And in that moment, a subtle transformation began, not in grand gestures, not in dramatic change, but in the soft awareness that power does not always announce itself, and respect does not always demand attention. Some of those who had spoken before now shifted slightly in their seats. Their eyes softened, their postures relaxed, and a quiet reflection began to take hold. They were not fully aware of it yet. Perhaps they never would be completely, but the seed had been planted. The seed of understanding that not every challenge requires an answer, not every judgment needs a reply, and that restraint can hold more weight than any display of argument. The man's calm continued, unbroken and serene. He did not seek to teach, but he had taught. He did not seek to impress, yet his presence left an impression. Each P. Rawson in the room began to feel the subtle power of being still, the quiet authority of someone who does not act to prove themselves, but simply carries their own dignity. And in that space, the room began to change, not outwardly, not in words, but inwardly. The whispers of amusement, the gentle smirks, the quiet judgments, all softened. A small humility began to stir, a gentle acknowledgement that strength can be silent, that power can be calm, and that the deepest lessons are sometimes felt rather than spoken. The man remained at the edge, untouched by expectation, unmoved by the attempts to draw him out. He sat quietly, breathing softly, watching, understanding, holding within him a calm that no laughter could disturb, no question could unsettle. And in that calm, the room began to learn slowly and quietly the value of someone who does not react, someone whose strength is in their stillness, and whose power lies in the restraint of their own voice. The quiet man remained at the edge of the room, and slowly the air around him seemed to change. It was not sudden. It was not dramatic. It was like the way a soft wind moves through a still field, barely noticed at first, until the grasses sway together in a gentle rhythm. The room's chatter had not stopped entirely, but it had softened, tempered by the calm presence that did not ask to be acknowledged. He did not speak. He did not gesture. He simply allowed the quiet to grow, letting the space breathe around him. And in that breathing, something remarkable began to unfold. The people who had once whispered, who had nudged each other with amusement, who had watched him with mild curiosity, now felt an unfamiliar weight. It was the weight of realization. Not harsh, not accusatory, but soft, quiet, and undeniable. Have you ever felt the shift that happens when someone refuses to follow the expected script? When the woe ruled anticipates anger or argument, and instead it meets patience, restraint, and calm. That shift is subtle, almost invisible, but it leaves a mark. It settles quietly in the mind and the heart. And that is what was happening now. The man's eyes moved slowly across the room, not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with deep understanding. He noticed the small changes, the way one listener's hand trembled slightly as their mind turned inward, the way another's shoulders dropped, softening against the chair as if tension had left their body without them noticing. Even those who had laughed earlier now sat more still, their amusement fading into a quiet awareness. It is strange how the silence of another can speak more than 1,000 words. How a calm presence, unshaken by judgment, can reveal truths that cannot be argued or dismissed. The man carried that silence effortlessly. It was not forced. It was not calculated. It was simply the natural reflection of someone who had learned that the world's expectations are often less important than one's own inner measure. Someone finally leaned slightly forward, almost imperceptibly, as if to test whether the quiet would break. "You do not speak much," the voice said. Soft, careful, half question, half observation. It carried no malice, yet it carried expectation. And still the man did not rush to answer. His lips did not move. His posture remained serene, and in that waiting he allowed the lesson to form in the listener's own mind. Have you ever noticed how people grow unsettled when someone refuses to react as they believe they should? When the world expects a display and instead finds only stillness, dignity, and calm. The uncertainty that follows is not always comfortable. It nudges at the mind, asking questions quietly, forcing reflection that words alone cannot create. The man's gaze softened. He was not waiting for recognition. He was not waiting for admiration. He simply observed, aware of the ripples his presence was sending through the room. And the room responded in the smallest ways first. A hand shifted. A foot stopped fidgeting. A smile faded, replaced by a gentle awareness that perhaps the assumptions they had carried were not entirely correct. It is often in these quiet moments that the deepest realizations take root. When someone chooses silence over reaction, they do not deny the world. They do not refuse to participate. They simply allow the space to see them as they truly are, and in doing so, they show others something they cannot demand: respect without contention, dignity without defense, strength without struggle. The soft golden light from the lamp filled the corners of the room, highlighting the calmness that now seemed to settle over every face. The laughter and whispers of before had diminished almost entirely, replaced by a subtle introspection. No one had been commanded to change. No one had been told they were wrong. The shift came simply from the presence of someone whose strength was quiet, whose power was patience, whose influence came from restraint. The man did not move, but the room itself seemed to shift toward him. The energy softened. The urgency faded. The subtle impatience that had filled the space now gave way to an unspoken understanding. They began to sense that his silence was not absence. It was choice. And in that choice, they were confronted with something they had rarely considered. That calm, undisturbed by judgment or expectation, carries its own quiet authority. And so the quiet man remained, serene and unmoved as the room breathed with his stillness. No words were needed to mark the lesson. No gestures were required to show the measure of his presence. They were beginning, slowly, to understand something deeper than any argument or debate. That true influence often comes not from speaking, but from remaining unshaken, and that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that chooses silence, allowing the world to reflect quietly on its own actions and assumptions. By the time the soft evening light stretched longer shadows across the floor, the room had grown calmer, heavier with thought, filled with the gentle awareness that the man's dignity and quiet power could not be challenged by impatience or judgment. He had not spoken loudly. He had not spoken loudly. Yet in the simplest way, through the restraint of his own voice and the steadiness of his presence, he had begun to leave an indelible mark on every heart in that room. The quiet man continued to sit at the edge of the room, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the air around him shifted. It was not a loud change. It did not arrive with sudden clarity. It was the gentle unfolding of a realization, the way dawn slowly softens the dark edges of a night sky. The people who had once whispered and laughed quietly now sat more still, as if the weight of his calm had begun to touch them in ways they could not yet name. Have you ever noticed how patience can carry more weight than words? How stillness can teach more than explanation? The man did not seek to teach, and yet his presence alone was teaching something profound. They had expected a reaction, a rebuttal, a spark to ignite their amusement. And when none came, they were left with a quiet question: why does this silence feel so heavy, so commanding, so inevitable? He did not lean forward. He did not change his posture. His hands rested softly on his knees. and his eyes moved gently across the room, taking in each subtle gesture. A hand shifted. A foot stopped, fidgeting. Eyes met his for a moment, then drifted away again. A small sigh passed somewhere near the back, almost unheard, yet it was enough to mark the change. It is strange, he thought, how the world measures strength. They expect it in noise, in display, in the rising and falling of voices that demand to be heard. And yet real strength, the kind that moves hearts and shapes, quiet understanding, often exists without demonstration. It is held quietly, carried carefully, and revealed only in the absence of reaction. Someone finally spoke. Their voice, soft, cautious, almost questioning. You do not respond. Yet it feels as if your words are already heard. The man's eyes lifted to meet theirs, and for a moment, a gentle understanding passed between them. He did not need to answer. He did not need to confirm. The silence itself carried the meaning, and it was enough. Have you ever noticed that silence can reveal more than speech? That, when someone refuses to react, they force the world to see themselves instead of the other. The man's quietness was not emptiness. It was not absence. It was presence in its most complete form. And in that presence, those who had once dismissed him now felt something they could not argue with. They felt a kind of power they had not anticipated. The light in the room, soft and gold, and fell across the man's face, highlighting the calm in his eyes, the gentle line of his mouth, the unshakable patience that had carried him this far. Shadows stretched across the floor, long and soft, as if the room itself had slowed to match his rhythm. And in this quiet, the people around him began to notice themselves. The small gestures of impatience, the faint judgments they had carried, the soft desire to provoke a reaction that had gone unmet. It is rare to witness this kind of restraint, he thought. Rare to carry one's own dignity without needing to prove it. And perhaps it is even rarer to see it reflected back in others. The quiet influence of a calm heart spreads slowly, not in an instant, not in applause, but in the subtle shifts of thought, the gentle rearrangement of awareness, the quiet understanding that respect can exist without confrontation. The room breathed differently now. The whispers of amusement had almost disappeared. The small smirks had softened. Even the movements of the body, the shifting of feet, the subtle leaning forward, had slowed. Each person felt, in their own way, the weight of a lesson carried not in words, but in presence. And the man, still calm and steady, allowed them this space to see it for themselves. Have you ever felt the quiet strength of someone who does not need to defend themselves, who does not need to assert their value? It is a strange sensation, almost uncomfortable at first. You feel the absence of noise, the lack of reaction, and yet it presses gently, insistently, on the mind. It asks questions that cannot be ignored, and leaves answers that cannot be spoken aloud. The man's gaze softened as he watched them. He did not seek acknowledgement, nor did he need it. He had already claimed the space within himself that no judgment, no whisper, no expectation could touch. And in claiming that space, he had begun to offer it silently to the others, a glimpse of what it means to carry one's own dignity without needing to prove it, to hold one's own power without demanding recognition. By the time the golden light softened into the deeper warmth of evening, the room had grown still. Not every heart understood what had passed. Not every thought would carry the full weight of the lesson. But something had shifted. Something subtle, quiet, and enduring. The calm, the restraint, the quiet authority of one man who refused to react had left its mark, settling softly into the minds and hearts of those who had once ignored him, teaching them a truth that words could never fully capture. And so he remained serene, unmoved, carrying the quiet power of inner strength, a presence so gentle and so firm that even in silence it spoke more loudly than any voice ever could.